I think there's a moment in many people's lives where something just quietly shifts. And it doesn't always come crashing down all at once. It's not some big dramatic explosion of doubt, but more like a slow turning of the head. A quiet, subtle realization that the story you've been told doesn't quite hold up under a closer look. For me, it started when I was still a kid. I remember sitting in a church pew, watching everyone around me with their heads bowed, eyes closed, hands together like they were tuning into some higher frequency I couldn't hear. And I did what I was told. I closed my eyes, I bowed my head, I folded my hands. But nothing ever happened. I didn't feel what they said I was supposed to feel. I didn't hear anything. No voice, no warmth, no connection, just silence. Back then, I thought maybe I was the problem. Maybe I wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe I was doing it wrong. And that thought alone was enough to make me feel guilty. Because when belief is packaged with the idea that doubt is a personal failing, you start blaming yourself before you ever question the system. But it wasn't just about prayer, it was the stories too. I started noticing little things, small cracks that most people just seem to gloss over. Like the idea of an all-loving being who could create an eternal torture chamber for the people who didn't love him back. Or the way morality was defined by obedience, not by empathy. Or how every answer to every hard question boiled down to a kind of spiritual shrug. God works in mysterious ways. That phrase always bothered me, because it didn't feel like an answer. It felt like the end of the conversation, and then there were the contradictions. Not just in scripture, though those were there too, but in real life. A person would get cancer and die, and people would say it was God's will. Another person would survive, and that was also God's will. One child would starve, another would be blessed, and we'd all nod as if randomness made sense once you dressed it in divine language. At some point, I started to wonder, if we have to twist everything into a kind of mental yoga just to protect the idea, maybe the idea isn't as solid as we want it to be. But it wasn't just intellectual, it was emotional too. The deeper I got into those thoughts, the more I started to realize how much fear was baked into belief. Not love, not joy, but fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of punishment, fear of stepping out of line. And that fear wasn't abstract. It was tied into identity, into family, into community, into the feeling that if I stopped believing, I'd lose more than just the idea of God. I'd lose everything that came with it. And that's what kept me quiet for a long time. Because the moment you say you don't believe, it's not just about theology. It's about betrayal. It feels like you're betraying your roots, your parents, your culture, even yourself. But when I finally allowed myself to let go of the fear, the world didn't fall apart. In fact, it got clearer. It was like taking off a pair of tinted glasses and seeing things in their actual color. Life didn't lose its meaning. It just stopped being shaped by a story I no longer believed. And suddenly, the questions became more interesting than the answers. What does it mean to live a good life if no one's keeping score? What does kindness mean when it isn't incentivized by reward? What does it say about us if we can be compassionate without a cosmic reason? And the more I asked those questions, the more I felt grounded, not in some metaphysical way, but in a deeply human way. Because doubt, when you stop fearing it, becomes a kind of freedom. It doesn't mean you have all the answers. It just means you're okay with not pretending to have them. That shift from fear to curiosity was the real turning point for me. That's when I stopped asking, is it okay to think this? And started asking, why didn't I think this sooner? And that moment, the one I thought would feel like loss, turned out to be a beginning. It's strange how we're taught that meaning has to come from something above us, that life needs to be part of some divine plan in order to matter. But if anything, it means more without that. Because it's temporary, it's fragile, it's unguaranteed, and that makes it ours. We're not here to fulfill some cosmic script. We're here because of a long chain of accidents, biology, luck, and time, and somehow, that's enough. And When I looked at the world without that filter, I started to appreciate things I never noticed before, not because they were signs, not because they were tests, but because they were just moments. Smile from a stranger, a quiet afternoon, the way light moves through leaves. Those things didn't need to mean anything beyond what they were. And that was beautiful. I started paying more attention to what people believed and why they believed it. Not to argue, not to attack, but to understand. And what I saw over and over again was that belief is often inherited, not discovered. People believe what they're born into, what their families taught them, what their communities reinforced. And questioning it, especially out loud, is often treated like betrayal. But the thing is, truth doesn't need protection. If something is true, it can stand up to scrutiny. It can handle doubt. It doesn't need to be shielded from questions. So when a belief system treats questions like threats, that's a red flag. I noticed how many apologetics, these defenses of belief, were built around maintaining the structure, not exploring the truth. The goal wasn't discovery, it was preservation. And that's when I started to see belief not just as a personal thing, but as a system that survives by discouraging doubt. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. And slowly, things that used to make sense in the religious frame started to unravel. Like the idea of sin, not as a mistake, but as a stain, something you're born with and can't wash off without outside help. Or the idea that morality is about obedience instead of impact, that doing the right thing is less about what helps people and more about what pleases a deity. When you peel that back, you start to realize how many harmful things have been justified in the name of that structure. Discrimination, suppression, guilt, shame, all dressed up as righteousness. And I couldn't help but ask, if a system requires shame to function, what kind of truth is that? Real morality doesn't need threats. Real kindness doesn't need eternal consequences. If your goodness depends on being watched, is it really goodness? These were the questions that slowly rewired how I saw the world, and it wasn't always comfortable. Letting go of deeply held beliefs is like pulling up roots. You feel exposed, untethered. There's a kind of grief in that, because even if the beliefs weren't true, they still shaped who you were. But over time, that grief turned into something else, something lighter. I stopped fearing death, not because I believe in anything after it, but because I stopped feeling like I was living just to earn something afterward. This life, the one I'm in now, is the only one I know I have, and that makes every moment count more. There's no do-overs, no second round, no eternal reward. Just now. And instead of that being terrifying, it started to feel liberating, because if nothing is guaranteed, then everything is precious. I also realized that the people I admire most, the ones I actually look up to, didn't get their values from religion. They got them from experience, from empathy, from understanding suffering, their own and others. And I think that's what matters. Not what book you read, not what church you sit in, but how you treat people when no one's keeping score. I know for some people belief gives them comfort, a sense of order, a narrative that makes sense of suffering. And I get that, but for me, the need for the story started to feel like a distraction from the real work, being present, being honest, and being responsible for my own choices. Because once you stop outsourcing morality, you have to own it. You can't blame it on a verse or a rule or a voice in the sky. It's you, your decisions, your mistakes, your growth. And that's harder, but also more meaningful. I've heard people say that without belief in something higher, life is empty, that morality breaks down, that chaos takes over, but the data doesn't support that. There are entire countries, places like Sweden, Norway, Japan, where belief is low but ethics are strong. Crime is low. Quality of life is high. People care for each other. Not because they fear hell, but because they value each other. That's not a coincidence. It shows that compassion isn't exclusive to belief. In fact, it might thrive better without fear getting in the way. And the more I saw that, the more I felt like I wasn't alone, that doubt wasn't a defect, but a sign of thinking. So if you're watching this and you've had those quiet thoughts, those little nudges, those moments when something didn't sit right, you're not broken, you're not failing, you're just paying attention. That's not rebellion, that's growth. And if it leads you away from belief, it doesn't mean you've lost something. It might mean you've found something else, something quieter, something harder, but maybe something more honest. I don't think there's one way this realization happens. For some, it's a single moment, a snap, a tragedy that doesn't make sense, a contradiction they can't ignore. For others, it's years of quiet questions stacking up until the story just can't hold them anymore. For me, it was a slow unraveling, a gentle undoing of knots I didn't know were there. It started with doubt, but it ended with clarity. Not answers to every question, not certainty about everything, but clarity in knowing that pretending to believe something you don't, just to fit in, isn't truth, it's survival. And that's not how I want to live. I want to be wrong sometimes. I want to learn. I want to shift when new evidence appears. I want to grow. And belief, at least the kind I was taught, didn't allow for that. It asked for obedience, for loyalty, for submission. But life asks for more. It asks for attention, for awareness, for accountability. And the moment I realized I didn't believe anymore, I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel lost, I felt awake. I started to see people differently too. Not as souls in need of saving, not as objects in a cosmic drama, but just people, struggling, hoping, trying. And I could help, not because it earned me points, but because it mattered. Because we share this life, this one brief, fragile life. And what we do here is all we have. That's not hopeless, that's human. The moment I realized I was an atheist, even if I didn't use that word at the time, wasn't the moment I gave up on meaning. It was the moment I started creating it. Not following a script, not chasing a reward, just living as honestly and fully as I can with the time I've got. Because that's enough, it has to be. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes it beautiful. It took me a while to realize that most people around me weren't believing because they'd examined all the alternatives. They were believing because it was easier than not believing. Because when you grow up surrounded by people who all agree on something, who treat that thing as sacred, as unquestionable, it doesn't feel like a belief, it feels like a fact, like gravity, like the color of the sky. And stepping outside of that, even just to take a look around, feels risky, dangerous, lonely. But once I did, I started to notice how many of the things people called truths were just assumptions they'd never felt allowed to examine. Like the idea that the universe must have a designer, that complexity automatically means intention, or that consciousness is too special to emerge from something non-conscious. These sound like deep ideas, but they fall apart if you actually follow them. Because if complexity requires a designer, then the designer must be even more complex. So who designed the designer? And if consciousness is too amazing to emerge from physical processes, then how did something conscious come from nothing conscious at all? You're still left with a mystery, just one step further removed. In other words, these answers aren't answers, they're placeholders. They move the mystery somewhere else and then tell you not to ask any more questions. And that's where belief often starts to reveal its true function. Not as a path to understanding, but as a way to shut down further inquiry. I started to see that a lot of what gets passed off as religious comfort is really just an aversion to uncertainty. Because uncertainty is hard. It's uncomfortable, it leaves questions open, it forces you to admit how small we really are. But the thing is, we are small, and pretending otherwise doesn't make us bigger, it just makes us less honest. What finally made me walk away wasn't anger, it wasn't some trauma or betrayal, it was just the slow realization that the beliefs I was handed didn't make sense of the world, they distorted it. And once I let them go, the world didn't become colder or emptier, it became clearer, sharper, more real. I started to see that morality didn't need myths, that meaning didn't need an external author, that love didn't need a cosmic justification. All of those things, kindness, wonder, responsibility, were still there. In fact, they mattered more, because now they were mine, chosen, built, earned, not handed down as rules from above, but created here, between people, in the real world. And that shift changes how you see everything. It changes how you forgive, because you're not doing it to score points with a god. You're doing it because holding on to resentment poisons both people. It changes how you grieve, because instead of thinking they're in a better place, you start to think they mattered while they were here, and that's enough. It changes how you celebrate, because you're not waiting for a paradise after death. You're living now in this moment, knowing it doesn't come twice. And all of that, every bit of it, felt more honest than anything I was taught in church. I don't need to believe there's a plan to care about people. I don't need eternal life to see this one as valuable. I don't need threats to know what's right. And I don't need sacred texts to feel awe. I feel awe when I look at the stars, not because I think someone hung them there, but because they're ancient and we're here, and somehow the atoms in our brains are capable of wondering where they came from. I feel awe when I hold someone's hand, not because love is divine, but because it's fragile and rare and real. I feel awe when I see someone help a stranger with nothing to gain. When I hear laughter in a hospital room. When I see resilience in the face of loss. Those moments don't need a God, they just need us to be present enough to notice them. That's what I didn't understand before. That life without belief isn't a life without wonder, it's a life without pretense. A life where you don't have to twist logic to make things fit, a life where you can say, I don't know, without shame. And in that space, the space left behind by belief, something else grows. Curiosity, humility, a quiet kind of courage, not the courage to die for an idea, but the courage to live without needing to believe something just because it feels good. Because comfort isn't the same as truth. And sometimes, letting go of comfort is the first step toward living honestly. There's this assumption a lot of people have that belief is what keeps society moral. That without religion, people would just start lying, stealing, hurting each other, that we need divine surveillance to keep us in line. But when you really think about it, if the only reason you're doing the right thing is because someone might punish you, is that morality? Or is that fear disguised as virtue? What I started to notice was that some of the kindest, most ethical people I knew didn't do what was right because of religion. They did it because they cared, because they'd suffered, because they understood what it felt like to be on the other side of cruelty. And on the flip side, some of the cruelest things I'd ever seen or heard about were done in the name of faith. That's not to say belief makes people bad, but it doesn't guarantee goodness either. And when morality gets tied to dogma, it becomes rigid. It stops asking, who does this help? And starts asking, what does the rule say? I realized that letting go of religion didn't mean losing morality, it meant rebuilding it from the ground up, based on empathy, on consequences, on human experience. Not what a book says, not what a preacher says, but what actually helps people suffer less, live better, and grow. And that shift, that recentering of ethics around people instead of commandments, felt more trustworthy, more consistent, more human. It also made me look differently at all those stories I was taught. The flood, the plagues, the battles, the sacrifices. Things I once saw as sacred now looked troubling. Stories where genocide was justified, where disobedience was punished with death, where women were treated as property, where slavery was regulated instead of condemned. I remember reading those parts and thinking if this book were written today, we'd call it barbaric. But because it's ancient, because it's holy, we excuse it. We rationalize it, we cherry-pick the nice parts and ignore the rest. But if you have to filter out half the book just to make it acceptable, what does that say about the book? I stopped seeing it as a source of wisdom and started seeing it as a window into a different time. A time when people didn't know how disease worked, or where the sun went at night, or what stars were made of. A time when power was preserved through fear, when conformity was enforced through myths, when asking the wrong question could get you exiled or worse. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The book hadn't changed. I had. I'd grown. I'd learned. I'd stepped outside of the frame, and suddenly the things that once seemed unquestionable became just one version of the truth, one culture's attempt to make sense of the world, not divine, just human, flawed, limited, like all of us. And that actually gave me more compassion, not less. Because once you stop seeing people as saved or damned, once you stop seeing belief as the line between good and evil, you start seeing the whole picture. You see the mother praying for her sick child, not as misguided, but as desperate, doing the only thing she knows how to do. You see the preacher who clings to his faith, not as manipulative, but as afraid to lose the identity that gives him purpose. You see the teenager asking questions, not as rebellious, but as brave. And even if you don't share their beliefs, you can still care. That's something belief didn't teach me, but doubt did. Doubt made me more patient, more open, more careful with my words, because I knew what it felt like to be inside the bubble, to believe something deeply, to fear what it would mean to lose it. That experience never leaves you. It's what makes me speak carefully now. Not because I'm unsure of what I think, but because I know how much it hurts to have the ground shift underneath you. And for a lot of people, that shift feels like the end of everything. But it's not. It's just the end of pretending. And that can be the start of something better. There's a kind of quiet people don't talk about. The quiet that comes after you stop believing. It's not silence in a scary way. It's just absence. No more prayers whispered into the dark, no more wondering if you're being watched, no more asking for signs. At first, it feels empty, but then it starts to feel peaceful, because for the first time, you're not performing, you're not trying to impress something invisible, you're just living, just being. And that's a shift that's hard to explain until you've felt it. You stop interpreting every little thing, every coincidence, every emotion as part of some bigger, hidden plan. You stop trying to decode the universe like it's some elaborate message, written just for you. And instead, you start noticing the world as it actually is, messy, complicated, imperfect, but also full of quiet moments that don't need to mean anything bigger to matter. A conversation that makes you feel understood, a book that stays with you, a memory that hits you out of nowhere, not miracles, just life. And maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need magic to feel grateful. Maybe we don't need destiny to feel wonder. Maybe it's okay to say, this is all there is, and still find it beautiful. Because what's more meaningful than knowing this is the only chance we get? No dress rehearsal, no second act, just now. And if we can still love, still care, still build, even with that knowledge, maybe that's the most profound thing of all. Letting go of belief didn't take anything away from me. It gave me back my own voice. It gave me permission to say, I don't know, and not feel ashamed. It gave me permission to let people be people, not categories, not missions, not threats to my worldview. It gave me space to grow. And maybe most of all, it gave me trust. Trust in reason, in evidence, in people, in myself. And that's not always easy, because reason doesn't always comfort you, people don't always do the right thing, and life doesn't always make sense. But it's real, and I'd rather live in a hard truth than a comforting lie. I'd rather build my values on something solid, empathy, compassion, understanding, than on ancient rules I can't question. I'd rather face death honestly and live like my time matters, not because someone is watching, but because no one is. Because the meaning isn't given to me, I give it. And maybe that's why I don't feel lost without belief. I feel responsible. I'm not waiting to be saved. I'm not hoping for reward. I'm not fearing punishment. I'm just here, doing the best I can, like everyone else. And that's the moment I realized I didn't believe anymore, and I didn't need to, because everything I thought I'd lose, everything I thought I'd miss, was never in belief. It was already here, in the world, in people, in this moment. And that's where I choose to live.